What makes this moment so unsettling is not only what powerful states are doing, but what the rest of the world is being forced to accept as normal. Hunger is no longer treated as a failure of systems or governance. It is being reframed as an unavoidable condition of the new era. Scarcity is presented as destiny rather than design. And once people accept that premise, the ground shifts beneath them. In the past, food crises were localized. A drought here, a war there. The rest of the world absorbed the shock. Today, the system is so interconnected and so tightly optimized that disruption in one critical node spreads everywhere. There is no buffer, no slack, no hidden reserve of abundance waiting to be unlocked. When a major supplier acts with intent rather than indifference, the consequences are global. This is why the control of food is more powerful than the control of energy. People can ration fuel. They can delay travel. They can substitute technologies. They cannot stop eating. Calories are the one input with no alternative. Whoever governs their flow governs behavior, politics, and ultimately survival. The uncomfortable truth is that the global order built after the Second World War assumed something that is no longer guaranteed. That food would always be plentiful enough to remain apolitical. That assumption underpinned trade agreements, alliances, and even moral frameworks. It allowed powerful nations to argue about values, while quietly relying on abundance to keep societies stable. That era is ending. As climate pressure intensifies, arable land shrinks in some regions and expands in others. Water becomes a strategic asset. Fertilizer becomes a bottleneck. Transportation corridors become pressure points. In that environment, countries with favorable geography are no longer just lucky. They are dominant. Russia's position in this landscape is not accidental, and it is not temporary. It is the product of geology, climate, and long-term planning intersecting at the right moment. Even as it faces military, economic, and demographic challenges, its leverage over food grants it resilience. It does not need to win decisively. It only needs to endure. For the West, this presents a dilemma that technology and finance cannot solve. You cannot code your way out of a soil deficit. You cannot sanction physics. Diversification helps at the margins, but it does not change the underlying map of fertility and inputs. The planet has limits, and those limits are becoming visible. This does not mean famine is inevitable everywhere. It means that food will increasingly be allocated through power rather than price. States will prioritize allies. Markets will give way to agreements. Neutrality will become harder to sustain. The world will not starve uniformly, but it will fracture. For ordinary people, this shift will feel like a slow erosion rather than a sudden collapse. Smaller portions, fewer choices, higher costs, more rules. Food will consume a larger share of income and attention, quietly reshaping daily life. Political arguments will grow sharper as material comfort shrinks. The greatest danger lies in what comes after acceptance. Once societies internalize scarcity as permanent, they begin to tolerate things they once rejected. Expanded state authority, restricted movement, managed consumption. The promise of security in exchange for compliance. History shows that these trades are rarely reversed. The weaponization of wheat is not just about Russia. It is about a world rediscovering an ancient truth it tried to forget. Control food, and everything else follows. Armies march on stomachs. Revolutions ignite around bakeries. Empires rise where harvests are secure, and fall where they are not. The Black Sea is no longer just a regional theater of war. It is a signal. A warning that the age of abundance was an exception, not a rule. The future will be shaped less by innovation alone, and more by access to the basics of life. In that future, power will not always announce itself with force. Sometimes it will arrive quietly, on an empty dock, in a delayed shipment, or in a price increase that makes survival just a little harder. And by the time the world fully understands what has changed, the leverage will already be in place. If you want to understand where real power lives in the modern world, don't look at microchips, oil rigs, or missile silos. Look instead at a quiet stretch of coastline where cranes stand idle and grain elevators cast long shadows over empty water. When the war in Ukraine began, one of the most alarming sights for global planners was not burning cities or advancing armor, but stillness. No ships, no movement, no grain flowing out of the Black Sea. What disappeared in that silence was not commerce, but calories. For centuries, this region functioned as one of humanity's most important food arteries. The soil beneath Ukraine and southern Russia is unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. A deep, dark layer of organic matter, capable of producing enormous harvests with minimal input. This land has fed empires, stabilized governments, and kept distant populations alive. When access to it is disrupted, the consequences ripple outward far beyond the battlefield. What unfolded in the early days of the war was not just a military operation, but a strategic interruption of the global food system. When Russian naval forces closed off access to Ukrainian ports, they didn't merely isolate a country. They interfered with a system that supplies a significant share of the world's staple grains. Millions of tons of wheat and corn sat trapped behind a naval cordon, unable to reach countries that depend on those shipments for basic survival. In that moment, food stopped being a commodity and became leverage. To grasp why this matters so deeply, it's necessary to strip away comforting ideas about agriculture and confront a harder truth. In global politics, wheat is not simply food. It is stability. It is social order. It is the difference between calm streets and burning ones. Throughout modern history, governments have learned the same brutal lesson again and again. When bread becomes unaffordable, authority collapses. Political ideology matters far less than whether people can eat. The wave of unrest that swept across the Middle East in the early 2010s is often remembered as a democratic awakening. But beneath the slogans and social media campaigns was a far more basic trigger. Grain prices surged after poor harvests in key exporting regions. And for countries that subsidize bread to maintain order, those price increases were catastrophic. Families felt it immediately. Governments lost control shortly after. Hunger did not cause every uprising, but it set the stage for all of them. This history is not obscure, and it is certainly not forgotten in Moscow. Russian leadership understands that controlling food flows can produce effects that armies alone cannot. The decision to squeeze Ukraine's exports was not a side effect of war. It was a deliberate act designed to apply pressure far from the front lines. The objective was not just territorial gain, but influence over nations thousands of miles away. What makes this strategy so striking is how sharply it contrasts with Russia's own past. For much of the 20th century, the Soviet Union struggled to feed itself. Collective farming systems were inefficient, incentives were broken, and yields lagged behind potential. Despite possessing some of the richest soil on the planet, the Soviet state routinely depended on foreign grain to avoid shortages. At times, this dependency exposed strategic weakness, signaling to rivals that food could be used against it. That vulnerability has now been reversed. Over the past 2 decades, Russia undertook a quiet but consequential transformation of its agricultural sector. Land ownership structures changed. Investment flowed into modern equipment, storage facilities, and export infrastructure. Productivity rose. Yields climbed. By the early 2020s, Russia had positioned itself as the world's largest wheat exporter, supplying a massive share of international markets. This alone would have given Moscow influence. But combined with the war in Ukraine, that influence multiplied by occupying or disrupting Ukrainian farmland and logistics. Russia reduced competition, while expanding its own relative share of global supply. The result was a level of market power rarely seen in food systems. Energy exporters can manipulate prices by controlling oil. Russia demonstrated that it could do something similar with grain. The effects were immediate. Prices surged across international markets, and importing nations felt the shock almost overnight. Countries with large populations and limited domestic production were hit hardest. In places where bread subsidies formed the backbone of social stability, governments scrambled to secure supplies at any cost. For the poorest regions, the consequences were more severe. Aid budgets stretched thin. Emergency reserves dwindled. Hunger crept closer. This pressure was not accidental. By amplifying scarcity, Russia increased its diplomatic leverage. Every spike in grain prices created anxiety in capitals across Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Leaders who had little stake in the conflict suddenly had strong incentives to engage with Moscow. Food insecurity became a bargaining chip. International efforts to ease the crisis produced fragile compromises. Agreements were reached to allow limited shipments through carefully monitored corridors. But these arrangements were never stable. They were adjusted, delayed, threatened, and renegotiated repeatedly. Each pause or slowdown sent markets into panic and reinforced the reality that food access now depended on political approval. What emerged from this process was something more troubling than a temporary disruption. It was the normalization of food as a tool of statecraft. Access to grain was no longer governed solely by price and logistics, but by alignment and obedience. Countries that maintained favorable relations with Moscow found supplies easier to obtain. Others faced uncertainty. This dynamic extended beyond wheat itself. Modern agriculture depends on more than land and labor. It relies on chemistry. Without synthetic fertilizers, global food production would collapse. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are not optional inputs. They are the foundation of industrial farming. And in this domain, Russia holds an even more commanding position. Russia is one of the world's leading suppliers of all major fertilizer components. Its access to cheap natural gas gives it an advantage in nitrogen production. Its mineral reserves support phosphate and potash output. Few countries possess such a complete set of inputs. This means that farmers across multiple continents depend, directly or indirectly, on Russian exports to maintain yields. When the war began, fertilizer markets reacted violently. Prices spiked. Availability tightened. For large agribusinesses, this meant higher costs. For small farmers in developing nations, it meant something worse. Many simply stopped using fertilizer altogether. The result was not an immediate famine, but a delayed one. Crops planted with insufficient nutrients produced less food months later, creating shortages that are harder to trace back to their source. This is what makes fertilizer such a powerful instrument. It doesn't create crisis instantly. It reshapes the future. Reduced application today means reduced harvests tomorrow. Once the cycle is broken, recovery is slow and expensive. Entire regions can slip backward in productivity, pushing millions closer to food insecurity. The geopolitical consequences are already visible. Countries heavily dependent on imported fertilizer have been forced into careful neutrality. Public condemnation gives way to quiet diplomacy when food systems are at risk. Sanctions regimes reflect this reality. While financial institutions and energy exports face restrictions, agricultural inputs are often exempted. The reason is simple. Cutting them off would cause damage far beyond the intended target. This creates a paradox. Nations opposing Russia's actions continue to purchase the very inputs that sustain its economy, because the alternative is global hunger. Moscow understands this constraint. It knows that in the realm of food, it is effectively unsafe. And this is only the beginning. The deeper shift lies in how climate change is altering the map of agriculture itself. While most countries view rising temperatures as a threat, Russia sees opportunity. Large portions of its territory have historically been too cold for intensive farming. As temperatures rise, these regions become more viable. The agricultural frontier moves north. Vast areas once locked under permafrost are gradually becoming accessible. With investment in infrastructure, they could be transformed into productive farmland. Russian planners are well aware of this potential. Long-term strategies emphasize adaptation, expansion, and new export routes that bypass traditional choke points. At the same time, other major producers face mounting stress. Water scarcity, heat waves, and soil degradation threaten yields in regions that have long anchored global food supply. As these pressures intensify, the balance of power shifts toward those with land, water, and climate resilience. This transformation is reshaping alliances. Countries with large populations and limited resources seek dependable partners. Trade becomes strategic integration. Infrastructure projects link farms to ports, ports to railways, and railways to markets across continents. Food security becomes inseparable from geopolitics. For decades, global stability rested on the assumption that food could always be bought somewhere. That assumption is eroding. Nations are stockpiling. Export controls are spreading. Trust in open markets is declining. What replaces it is a more fragmented world, divided not only by ideology, but by access to calories. This is the new geography of famine. It is not defined by drought alone, but by decisions made in distant capitals. It is shaped by blockades, contracts, exemptions, and alignments. In this world, hunger is no longer just a humanitarian problem. It is a strategic variable. And as this reality sinks in, one uncomfortable truth becomes clear. The war over Ukraine is not only being fought with weapons, it is being fought with bread, fertilizer, and time. As nations began to realize that food could no longer be treated as a neutral commodity, fear started to spread faster than hunger itself. Fear changes behavior, and at the level of states, it produces a single, predictable response: self-preservation. Once Russia demonstrated that access to grain and fertilizer could be manipulated for political effect, governments around the world stopped assuming that global markets would protect them. They started preparing for a future where markets fail. This marked the quiet death of the system that had fed the world for decades. For most of the modern era, food trade operated on a just-in-time logic. Countries did not store large reserves because storage was expensive and inefficient. Instead, they trusted that ships would always arrive, contracts would always be honored, and someone somewhere would always have surplus to sell. That trust was shattered. The first reaction was defensive. Major food-producing nations began restricting exports to shield their own populations from rising prices. These decisions were politically rational, but globally disastrous. When one country blocks exports, prices rise elsewhere. That rise encourages another country to do the same. What follows is a cascade. Within a short period, dozens of governments imposed controls on wheat, rice, cooking oil, meat, and fertilizers. Each decision made domestic sense. Collectively, they dismantled the foundations of global food trade. Nowhere is this shift more visible than in the behavior of China. Quietly and methodically, Beijing has accumulated enormous food reserves. It now holds a staggering share of the world's stored grain, far beyond what is needed for short-term emergencies. This is not speculation or panic. It is strategic preparation. Chinese planners are operating on the assumption that future supply disruptions are not temporary anomalies, but permanent features of the global system. This hoarding has consequences. Grain locked in storage is grain not circulating in markets. Reduced availability pushes prices higher, reinforcing the very instability nations are trying to escape. The world is entering a feedback loop where fear of scarcity creates actual scarcity. For wealthy countries, the impact is uncomfortable but manageable. Food inflation squeezes household budgets, sparks political anger, and reshapes elections. But it does not immediately threaten survival. For poorer nations, the consequences are existential. When food prices rise even slightly, millions fall below the threshold of subsistence. Governments that cannot subsidize imports face unrest they cannot control. This widening gap is producing a new global divide. It is no longer enough to categorize nations as developed or developing, democratic or authoritarian. The more relevant distinction is between those that can secure food under any circumstances and those that cannot. Food security is becoming the true measure of sovereignty. As this pressure mounts, states begin to behave differently toward their own populations. History shows that governments under resource stress become more coercive, not more generous. When leaders can no longer guarantee abundance, they attempt to control distribution. Rationing returns, often framed as sustainability, efficiency, or public good. Surveillance expands to monitor consumption. Markets give way to mandates. This is not speculation. It is pattern recognition. Every major food or resource crisis produces the same trajectory. First comes denial, then temporary controls. Finally, permanent restructuring of the relationship between the state and the citizen. The danger lies in how quickly emergency powers become normalized. Laws written for short-term crises rarely disappear once the crisis passes. They remain dormant, waiting for the next justification. In a world of digital finance and centralized systems, the mechanisms of control are more precise than ever before. Food scarcity does not exist in isolation. It interacts with debt, inflation, and monetary instability. As households spend a larger share of income on essentials, economic growth slows. Governments face declining tax revenues just as social spending demands increase. The temptation to extract wealth rather than create it grows stronger. History offers sobering examples of what happens next. When states face obligations they cannot meet and unrest they cannot suppress through prosperity, they turn to force. Property rights weaken. Savings are redefined as public resources. Legal frameworks are reinterpreted to justify extraordinary measures. These actions are always presented as temporary, necessary, and unavoidable. What makes the current moment uniquely dangerous is that these pressures are converging simultaneously. Food insecurity, climate stress, demographic growth, and geopolitical rivalry are all intensifying at once. There is no excess capacity left to absorb shocks. The margins are gone. Russia understands this environment well. Its strategy is not built on winning quick victories, but on enduring longer than its rivals. Control over food inputs grants it time. Time to wait out sanctions. Time to exploit divisions. Time to let external pressures weaken opponents from within. Every year that global food systems remain unstable, Russia's leverage grows. Each failed harvest elsewhere strengthens its position. Each export ban reinforces the logic of resource nationalism. The world drifts further from cooperation and closer to managed scarcity. This is why the weaponization of wheat is so dangerous. It does not require constant action. Once the precedent is set, the system begins to fracture on its own. Other powers observe and learn. If food can be used as leverage, why wouldn't they do the same? The logic spreads. The result is a future where access to basic necessities depends less on markets and more on alliances. Loyalty is rewarded with supply. Neutrality becomes risky. Independence becomes expensive. Hunger becomes political. And for ordinary people, This transformation is largely invisible until it is too late. It arrives gradually, disguised as inflation, shortages, or temporary measures. But beneath the surface, the rules are changing. The world is not simply becoming poorer, it is becoming more controlled. Scarcity concentrates power, and those who control food control everything built on top of it. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this video and want to stay updated with more insights on finance, make sure to subscribe to my channel, Financial Coin, and don't forget to hit that bell icon so you never miss our latest videos.